Good afternoon, and welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts program, Art in Context. I'm Linda Friedlander, Head of Education here at the Center. Today's speaker, Laurel Peterson, will speak on Family, Friends, and Self, Jonathan Richardson's Portraits on Paper. In the last 2 decades of his life, Jonathan Richardson produced hundreds of portrait drawings, a substantial proportion of them self-portraits. Laurel discusses a selection of these striking portraits, looking at Richardson's techniques in chalk and graphite, in drawings of himself, his son, and his friends. He explores the professional and the personal significance of these intimate portraits to the artist, who consider drawing the very spirit and quintessence of art. Laurel Peterson is Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Yale Center for British Art. She received her BA and PhD in the History of Art, Yale University, and holds an MA from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. Peterson has held positions in the Prints and Drawings Department of both the Morgan Library and Museum and the British Museum. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so through the program. We will be using the Q&A feature on your navigation bar to gather your questions, and we will attempt to answer them at the end of the program, but feel free to submit questions at any time. If you would like to use closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking on the icon on your toolbar. Yale University acknowledges that the indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Western Pequot, Sagatuck, Gold Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways what is now the state of Connecticut. And now, Laurel Peterson.
Thank you, Linda, for that introduction. And it's wonderful to be with you all virtually today. On a large sheet of blue paper, the face of a man gazes back at us. His face is rendered predominantly with red chalk, and we can observe individual strands of hair, the slight creases in the forehead, and his strong nose. On the forehead and the nose, the white chalk gives a sense of light shining on his skin, as if from a window or a candle. In many ways, it seems to be an unflinching portrayal, capturing the slight bags under his eyes and just a little bit of a jowl under the chin. We seem to be able to lock eyes with him, and indeed, if you were looking at this drawing in the flesh, you would find the head to be almost life size. The gaze is arresting. With his closely cropped hair and no identifying costume, he seems almost timeless, as if we could encounter him on the street today or 300 years ago. This red chalk drawing on blue paper is one of the scores of self-portraits that the artist Jonathan Richardson Sr. produced during his lifetime. He made these works predominantly in the last decades of his life, after he retired from his practice as a portrait painter. He was a prolific draftsman. Of the drawings that had passed to his son on his death in 1745, at least 1,000 were by Richardson Sr., and when these were auctioned in 1772, more than 650 of that group were portraits, and a large proportion of these were self-portraits, and we know about 55 of them today. That large number was quite noteworthy. Indeed, the writer and man of letters Horace Walpole remarked at the sale that after Richardson's retirement from business, the good old man seems to have amused himself with writing a short poem and drawing his son's portrait every day. Horace Walpole was known for exaggeration, and from the surviving drawings, it can't have been a daily practice. But nonetheless, Richardson was a prolific producer of his own visage. At the Yale Center for British Art, we have 4 self-portrait drawings, as well as 1 print, all produced in Richardson's later years. The collection also has 3 drawn portraits of his eldest son, Jonathan Jr., as well as portrait drawings of other friends. The group of drawings on the screen is representative of his practice, and as I'll discuss, they were part of how he shaped and understood his social and artistic identities in his later years. Richardson's passion for self-portrait drawings has inspired a great deal of interest. Indeed, a 2015 exhibition at the Courtauld Gallery and its accompanying catalog by Susan Owens inspired my own interest, in large part because it's relatively unusual to see an artist experimenting with the same subject over and over again in the 18th century and to have so many drawings survive. And particularly, it seems that he approached the subject with pleasure and interest. Today, of course, we're accustomed to taking and making our own images. Selfie culture abounds, but selfies in many ways are used to project an image of ourselves to a wider circle as we publish them to Instagram or videos of ourselves to TikTok, although some, of course, we keep just for ourselves. Richardson's self-portraits are much more self-reflective, and they're centered on observing himself. They're also the work of a man in retirement, made for pleasure and introspection. These were, it's important to note, autonomous works rather than preparatory for paintings. There was no kind of later end goal for them. I've loved these drawings for a long time, but they've become even more poignant to me after the past 2 years of spending time in lockdown. And I think that we have all spent more time looking inward during the past months. And of course, that is what Richardson was doing when making his self-portrait. Today, I'll discuss Richardson's portrait drawings and also link them more broadly to his practice as an artist and as a collector. I'll look closely at his draftsmanship and at the purpose behind some of these drawings. Jonathan Richardson was born in London in 1667, and his father was a silk weaver. He trained initially as a scrivener before becoming apprenticed to the portrait painter John Riley. And after his apprenticeship, he established a successful career as a portrait painter and portrayed many significant figures in the world of art and politics of the late 17th and early 18th century. And I'm just showing you here 2 oil paintings from the center's collection to give a sense of his work in this medium. Alexander Pope on the left and Francis, the 2nd Earl of Godolphin, on the right. By the end of his career, he was one of the most expensive portrait artists working in London. And apparently, his talent had been noticed and he had been offered an appointment at court, but he declined because he had an aversion to what he called the slavery of court dependence. Not everyone, not all of his contemporaries loved his work, and Horace Walpole, who we've met before, was quite dismissive of Richardson as a portrait artist, and he said that he, quote, drew nothing well below the head and was void of imagination. But Walpole was notoriously critical, so you can draw your own conclusions. Richardson also helped to shape future generations of artists and art collectors. At the time that he was working in the first decades of the 18th century, Britain did not have a strong centralized academy for the study of art as they had in France. The Royal Academy in Britain would not be founded until 1768, more than 20 years after Richardson's death. But Richardson was one of the founders of a smaller academy, the Great Queen Street Academy, which was established to give artists instruction. And also of great importance, he was a theorist and a writer of art historical treatises, such as his 1715 essay on the theory of painting. And as I will discuss later on, Richardson had one of the most important collection of drawings of his time, with nearly 5,000 old master drawings, which has had an impact on artists and art institutions ever since. When Richardson began to step away from his professional practice and move toward retirement in about 1728, he turned to making these self-portrait drawings, such as the one with which we began. He was, of course, following in a long tradition of self-portraiture, which really became a mode for exploration for European artists beginning at the time of Dürer in the 15th century. Rembrandt was a particular hero of Richardson's and another practitioner of the self-portrait. Indeed, one of the most substantial parts of Richardson's collections were works by Rembrandt, and he probably had the largest collection of drawings by the Dutch master at the time, which included about 120 drawings as well as 22 prints, including this self-portrait etching by Rembrandt, which is now in the British Museum. Self-portraits provide plenty of scope for artistic experimentation, since you don't have to find someone to sit for you, and you don't have to worry about the sitter's dissatisfaction with the results unless you're worried about yourself. And I'm just showing you here a group of portraits on blue paper from the British Museum to give you a sense of the range of Richardson's output. And and also the kind of time span, beginning with this portrait in 1728 at the age of 63 to this in 1742 at the age of 75. In a drawing, as opposed to a painting, Richardson could work quickly and more instinctively. When an artist works on an oil portrait, he has to plan in advance and complete the work over multiple settings to build up the layers in order to produce the final portrait, which can take days and weeks. These chalk portraits could be done in a day, and some of them he even labels with the date they were finished, such as this one here is dated August 30th, 1733. In these self-portraits, we see Richardson in various poses, sometimes in his own hair, other times wearing a soft cloth cap. Rarely does he portray himself in a wig, which would have been his more public persona, although of course we do have this example here. This is another example from the center's collection, and clothing in these portraits is usually not of particular interest to Richardson. The hat here almost dissolves off the page, and it mostly seems to serve as a demarcation across his brow. Often, what Richardson captures most deftly and with the greatest interest are the eyes and their expression. He did not always work with chalk on blue paper, and indeed, portraits of his friends are more likely to be done with graphite or with pen and ink, which I'll discuss more later. But blue, for Richardson, worked very well because with chalk, it provides a kind of midtone, so that he could work much more in the way that he would have worked with oil paint, applying dark black chalk for the shadows and white chalk for highlights, which we see him doing here with you get again this light on the nose and then the shadow across his face. And this is quite a painterly way to draw in many ways. Blue paper, as well as providing this midtone, also has a slightly rougher surface, which makes it work particularly well with chalk. He has, as we've already seen, he did use different combinations of colored chalks in his drawing, as we see again in this pensive portrait from the center's collection. Here, again, the careful attention to the eye, and he's also interested in the way that his hand is interacting with his face. You can imagine him leaning and looking at himself in the mirror while he draws. But the hand is only as interesting to him as it interacts with the face once he gets to the pinky. So he sort of gets much more sketchy. One of the things that I find interesting about this drawing is that it's torn. You can see this slight tear on the end, and we don't know about the history of this event when the tear occurred, but it does seem possible to me that it could have happened early on in the life of the drawing. And it suggests that maybe these were not always the most precious of objects. If Richardson was producing them regularly, they didn't have the kind of preciousness that a work that he was going to sell might have. And blue paper is relatively inexpensive as well. So there was not a huge amount of financial investment involved in the production of these drawings. Over the course of the years that Richardson was making these self-portraits, he was also writing poetry. And in these poems, he often reflected on the passing of time and age. And as we look at him studying the details of his face in these portraits, that sense of fleeting time seems very present. But he also saw drawing self-portraits as a kind of self-examination for self-betterment. And the sense of introspection is actually literally inscribed on this portrait. In his handwriting, at the base of the drawing are the words quod adest componere, which is a contraction of the phrase quod adest memento componere ecus, which is a line from Horace that means, remember to settle the problem at hand with a level spirit. It seems almost as if he is referring to the challenge posed by the very act of self-portraiture. Richardson's exploration of himself was also tied in his later years to representations of his son. And his son was another very willing sitter, and the two lived together, which made it easy for Richardson to draw his son frequently. And it seems possible that the portrait we were just looking at was intended as a pair. And I just wanted to show you a photo of the two works together in the study room at the center, because in an ideal world, we would be looking at these works in person and you would get a sense of them as objects, not simply as images on the screen. So I hope that this gives a little bit of a sense of their scale. And if you've never visited the center, this also gives you a sense of where they live. So to look more closely at the pair, we see that the chalk is handled in a very similar way. The caps are both outlined in red, and the blue paper is very similar in tone. And I love the way Richardson mingles red and black chalk in the chin to kind of create a sense of definition and shadow. And on the drawing of his son, Richardson has inscribed the date August 29th, 1733. And just this morning, I realized I wonder if another work should be put into a conversation, because the drawing we were looking at earlier is inscribed with the date the 30th of August, 1733, just one day after the portrait of his son. So perhaps this was a period of particular activity for Richardson. I think it might be worth exploring more the relationship between these three portraits. As I said, the two Jonathans were extremely close, and they lived together until Jonathan Sr.'s death. The elder referred to his son as his other self, and the two worked closely together on projects. Indeed, they wrote 2 books together, and listed somewhat idiosyncratically, the author was given as Mr. Richardson, Sr. and Jr., almost as if they were 2 parts of a single whole. And both in these self-portrait drawings, as well as across the collection, their handwriting intermingles. Both of them would write inscriptions on drawings, and Richardson's great collection, the elders, passed to his son after his death. So his son was important in kind of maintaining and shaping the legacy of his father. The chalk drawings on blue paper gave Richardson the opportunity to experiment with tones, with expression, and observations of himself and his son. But as I've said, they don't represent the totality of his output as a portrait draftsman during this period. He also produced numerous highly finished graphite portraits on vellum. These tended to be portraits of others, and were often copies that he made from paintings, either paintings that he'd done himself or by others. It's likely that this portrait of Jonathan Jr. may be a copy after another painting. And I want to just take a look closely at this portrait of Jonathan Jr. because it gives such a different sense of Richardson's draftsmanship. This is a very fine, detailed drawing where he has paid incredible attention to the curls of his son's hair, to the fine hatching along his chin where he creates this shadow and definition. Where the chalk drawings were loose and sketchy, this is very tight and precise. Vellum, unlike blue paper, is very smooth and works really well with the hard graphite and allows the artist to make very precise, detailed strokes. And although he may look giant on your screen, this portrait is actually much smaller than the chalk drawings. These portraits on vellum are closer to the size of your hand. So it's something that's meant to be looked at close, held very close and intimately. Richardson used this style to produce portrait drawings of his friends. I'm showing 3 here. Sir Hans Sloane, who was the man whose collections formed the basis of the British Museum, the artist James Thornhill in the center, and the poet Alexander Pope at right, who was a great friend and frequent subject of Richardson's. And while these graphite drawings, as I've described, often were done as copies, other times Richardson seems to have used sketches to prepare them. And we can see that with the portrait of Hans Sloane, because there's a very closely related sketch in the British Museum. It seems likely that Richardson could have used the pen and ink sketch to quickly make a portrait of Sloane while he visited him. And then once he returned home, he might have created the more refined version in graphite that we see on the left. We know that he must have intended loose sketches for this more finished purpose because some of them are inscribed for the vellum. In his essay on the theory of painting, first published in 1715, Richardson expressed how, upon the sight of a portrait, the character and master strokes of the history of the person it represents are apt to flow in upon the mind and to be a subject of conversation, so that to sit for one's picture is to have an abstract of one's life written and published, and ourselves thus consigned over to honor or infamy. For Richardson, portraiture thus had a very strong biographical component. And it's important to remember that in the early 18th century, most people weren't portrayed all that often. So a single portrait had to be extremely representative of them and their life. Richardson also believed that portraiture should elevate sitters, to emphasize their good qualities, to make a wise man to be more wise, a brave man to be more so, a modest, discreet woman to have an air something angelical, and so of the rest. And so in the way that he produces these more finished portraits, I imagine him thinking about the qualities of the individuals that he wants to convey, which is different than the way when he's just simply studying his own feature in the passing of time. For Richardson, these more finished graphite portraits could express a biography, which is much more akin to a painted portrait. Richardson produced many, many of these small portraits, and they included people who had died long before his birth, such as this portrait of Raphael, which is after a painting. And it seems that these portraits, both men and women who were living and those who had died, perhaps were gathered together in some way, perhaps in an album, but were somewhere where Richardson had ready access to them. For in one poem, he wrote of his rooms, "As here I sit and cast my eyes around, the history of my past life is found, the dear resemblances of those whose names nourish and brighten more the purest flames." And so we sort of see him sitting here looking around at his friends, thinking about himself in relation to the people that he knows, as well as the people that are his heroes, like Raphael. Groups of portraits were very important during this period. Clubs often commissioned groups of portraits. Most famous among them are the portraits by Sir Godfrey Kneller of the Kit Kat Club. But grouping portraits together was a way of kind of establishing a collective identity and associating yourself with others. So by collecting these portraits, I think Richardson was sort of drawing out his professional and personal networks in a way that he had access to while at home. Sort of assembling a community around himself. And we can imagine him looking through these albums, thinking of his friendships and the people he admires. It becomes a kind of personal pantheon within his home. But beyond making portraits, drawing for Richardson had deep meaning in his life. It was not simply a professional tool, but it was a way of exploring his own interests and meditating on his life in the last decades, and for expressing relationships and friendships. In this love of drawing, it's worth contextualizing more deeply Richardson's relationship with his collection of old master drawings. As I mentioned earlier, Richardson was an extremely important collector of old master works, and I'm showing you just a handful here, works by Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Rubens, Carracci, and Rembrandt. These drawings are now owned in major collections around the world. The ones I'm showing here are from the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, and the Morgan Library, but they are sort of across the world. They also passed through the hands in the 18th century. Many of these drawings passed through the hands of other British artists, such as Sir Joshua Reynolds and Sir Thomas Lawrence, who also had important collection. Of drawing by these old masters, Richardson had written, quote, "These are exceedingly prized by all who understand and can see their beauty, for they are the very spirit and quintessence of the art." For Richardson, it seems there was nothing more true to the artist's hand than a drawing, as opposed to a painting where many people might have worked on it. And this is true for others as well, for whom drawing represents the kind of closest representation to the original idea. And when making his own chalk drawings on blue paper, as well as his graphite works, Richardson undoubtedly was looking to his own collection of works on blue paper and other papers. Blue paper was first associated with Venetian drawing in the Renaissance and then gained popularity among artists throughout Europe. And I can't help but make a comparison with this lovely drawing of a head of a girl by Dennis Calvert, who was a Dutch-born artist who lived and worked in Bologna. And this from around 1580. And this was a work that was in Richardson's collection. And I put them side by side, not to suggest that Richardson was directly inspired by this small study of a head, but rather to show the way in which he might have been thinking through the materials and techniques of his artistic predecessors, that the study of his own collection must have certainly influenced the works that he was producing himself. And for him, drawing was a way to explore himself as well as to study. And you might wonder about how we know so much about the works in Richardson's collections. And one of the ways that we know is that he frequently placed a collector's stamp on his drawings. And I'm showing you here in the lower corner, you can see a JR. Although making a mark on a drawing might seem somewhat shocking today, this was a common practice of collectors of drawings in particular, which continued into the 20th century. And Richardson's almost invariably has this combined JR, although sometimes it's surrounded by an artist's palette. Richardson also had a characteristic framing style that he used, and this is another work that was in his collection. He would sort of create these frames for his drawings, and often he would inscribe them with the attribution here to Parmigianino, an attribution that still holds today. Sometimes in Richardson's drawings that he owned, he has notations on the back about the attribution or other facts about the drawing. So his notes are very useful to scholars. They continue to be useful to scholars. Indeed, but this marking of drawings with collector's stamps and framing is something that he occasionally did with his own portraits as well, such as we see in this self-portrait from the center's collection with this beautiful Richardson frame around it, but also the collector's stamp. And in the drawing with which we began, you can see just faintly at the side of the drawing here, the combined JR. And I think this is a sort of important aspect to understand Richardson and the role that self-portraits played within his collection. It seems that he is thinking about the posterity of these drawings and placing his mark on them. He might envision them after his death going out into the world, being collected by others perhaps, and that he himself becomes inserted into his collection of old master drawings. Maybe he anticipates that the drawing could be used for study or contemplation by other artists, just as he had used the drawings in his own collection. To me, Richardson, particularly in his latter years, seems like a man who thought through and with paper. Self-portraiture was part of that study, was a study in self-reflection, but it was also a way of leaving something of himself to posterity and to linking himself to a longer tradition of artists working on paper. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurel. That was really fabulous. We do have some questions coming in after the talk. If you do have questions, please use the Q&A or the chat option on your toolbar. And to get us started, we have a question about framing. Someone asks, what would Richardson's frames be made of? Is it similar to what we would call cardboard?
That's a great question. And so I think it's much closer to paper than cardboard. It's not quite as heavy or as thick. And he often does have this, I can just go back quickly, this sort of the gold around it. And so it's a thicker paper, but not as matted as cardboard.
Yeah, that's great. Another question about process. You spoke a lot about the blue paper and what you call chalk. When you refer to that, how can we relate that to something that maybe we would use in contemporary art making today, like charcoal or pastel? Is it a similar type of, how would you describe red chalk?
Red chalk is close to pastel, but it's a very dry medium. It's not as kind of greasy. Pastel has a little bit more it's a little greasier. Red chalk, it's a kind of an earth pigment, and I think it's very similar in many ways to a kind of red chalk that you might, it's not as highly processed as a contemporary red chalk might be, but it's fairly similar to kind of red chalk that you might be able to buy to use today.
Okay.
And it's a different material than charcoal, although also those two are quite close.
Mm-hmm. But it's not like a Conti crayon kind of.
No, it's not. Yeah.
A question about Richardson's practice with his painting. Did Richardson ever use drawings in his painting practice, and how did the two relate?
He did. So Richardson frequently work directly on the canvas. So there aren't some artists will make preparatory sketches. So there are lots of drawings associated with their portraits. That's not the case with Richardson, but on some instances, he did make preparatory drawings, and that particularly with sitters such as royal subjects, there's a portrait, for instance, of the Prince of Orange, where he did a blue chalk drawing. And in large part, that's probably because sort of princes and kings didn't have a lot of time to sit to artists. It takes a long time to make an oil portrait. So Richardson probably made the drawing sort of from life, and then he could take that back to his studio and work up the portrait from them. And much like his own self-portrait, the real interest is in the face, in the kind of all the facial features, and the sort of hair and clothing is much less closely represented because he could have used props or taken whatever outfit the sitter wanted to be seen in, he could take back to his studio and render much more carefully. So there are some instances where he used drawing to make for later portraits.
Excellent. We have a question and some praise. Found your comparisons with drawings and other artists from Richardson's collection particularly illuminating. Can you say more about how he would have approached making his self-portraits in technical terms? Would he have used a mirror? Is there any evidence that he used a camera obscura or similar optical device for drawings of others?
That's a great question, and I hadn't considered the use of optical devices, and something definitely worth looking into. He didn't write a huge amount about he wrote a lot of poetry, but not a lot about kind of how he was making these portraits. It seems quite likely to me that he was certainly using a mirror of some sort. And one thing that scholars have postulated is that making the self-portraits could have been sort of part of his morning routine, because he typically woke up quite early and went walking and would write poetry. And so it seems like that, and those were kind of the hours that he had to himself. And it seems likely that he could have been making these portraits at that time. And I wonder about there's always a sense of a fairly strong light source. And some of these, as we've seen, were made in August, so the summer light would have been very strong. And so I sort of like to think of him sitting looking out getting the morning sun on his face to create that sense of illumination. But that's just conjecture.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question about framing. There was a question going back to the frames, if the gold shown is a double mount or is it just a drawn line?
I would have to look again at I'm not confident enough to answer that question. I have to look again at the drawings. It's the disadvantage of not having them right at hand.
Right. One of our guests asks if there are any known images or information about the wife or mother of this family were portraits made of her as well.
It's a great question, and one that I've sort of been grappling with for this presentation. Richardson was married. His wife was the daughter of John Riley, the man that he apprenticed with. And there are some drawings of her, and there is a drawing in the center's collection which is labeled as Mrs. Richardson, and it's written on the drawing but not in Richardson's handwriting. And she doesn't look close. She doesn't look like the other drawings of Richardson's wife. So I was going to include her initially, but I decided not to, because I can't quite decide on her identity, and they need to do some more work on that. But and he also had other children of whom there are drawings, but no one did he render as much as his eldest son. The others sort of, there are just kind of a handful of drawings of them.
Mm-hmm.
She had died by the time he retired, so she would not have been part of that kind of practice of portraiture at home.
Wonderful. Let's see, another question coming through the chat. Why do you think that Joshua Reynolds was such a prolific collector of Richardson's drawings?
Another great question. I think, I guess there are two prongs of, he was a collector of drawings that Richardson owned, as well as a collector of drawings by Richardson. And I would imagine, because Reynolds was such a great collector of drawings, there's a kind of affinity with with Richardson. Richardson was also, I sort of think of him as Reynolds' kind of professional grandfather, because Richardson trained Thomas Hudson, who then trained Reynolds. So there's a strong lineage of portrait artists through that. So I think that there's a lot of affinity there.
Mm-hmm. And a last question about the archival nature of these drawings. How are they sustainable this long? Are they fixed? Is there some kind of, do we do anything to them in a contemporary sense to keep them from wearing or smudging?
I don't believe that they are fixed. And I was hoping to look at them. I hope to look at them with our conservators soon to answer that question. I mean, now they've been in, many of them have been in kind of in collections and sort of cylinder boxes for a long time. So that's helped preserve them. And they don't get a lot of, they haven't been exhibited that often. So they're in very good condition, just sort of living their lives in museum study rooms.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much again for this fabulous talk. Please join us on Thursday for our at-home program, Digital Docents, the Calm Before the Storm. Our docent, Susan Dardick, will be presenting on Spencer Frederick Gore and Walter Sickert. Thank you, Laurel, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Take care.